Hello and welcome to a new edition of Need to Know, a series of video interviews with companies who are shaping, creating and innovating in the games industry today, and whose work will have a huge impact going forwards into the future. Today I'm delighted to welcome Jess Pembroke, Director of Information Law Services at Naomi Corn Associates, here to talk to us today about privacy and data protection in games development, and specifically exploring the Children's Code. Jess, it's lovely to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get going, would you like to tell our viewers a little bit about your background and what it is that you do at Naomi Corn Associates?
Thank you, Leo. It's lovely to be here. So I started as a data protection officer before the GDPR. So quite a long time ago in the early 2000s, I started working in health in the NHS. And even back then, it was all about what data are we collecting as an organisation and what do we want to do with it. And there was legislation in place pre-GDPR, the old data protection legislation, and it had the kind of similar concepts that we see today in terms of principles and the way you tell people how you use their data. I think what changed when the GDPR came into place, there was a couple of things. There was certainly a lot of energy around the impact on organisations if they didn't comply with the GDPR. The level of fines at the time were touted as having a really big impact if an organisation was to breach that legislation, but also the requirement for some organisations to have a data protection officer. And I've seen in the 15 years I've been working in data protection law, that industry of professional data protection officers and people who either work for organisations or advise organisations on things like privacy, ethics, and more recently things like AI has really expanded into a very vibrant community of professionals. And at Naomi Corn Associates, I have the privilege of leading our team of those professionals to provide those kind of services to clients. So we have a range of clients in all different sectors, including some in health, some in software, in the creative sector, and the staff that I work with provide advice, guidance and training to those clients on all aspects of data protection and privacy.
Absolutely, that's wonderful to hear. And I should say from the outset, we've got a training partnership with Naomi Corn Associates here at Ukie, and I'll be more than happy to link down in the bottom of the description to some of the training courses on offer. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jess. It's helpful to understand your background and look at some of the history in here. I think we should jump straight in then. I mean, you were talking about obviously data protection. I think it would be helpful to understand a little bit more about the law in the UK and maybe particularly around sort of relevance to the EU, perhaps. How does that sound?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned there about GDPR, and in the UK, we have the UK General Data Protection Regulation. But back when it first came in 2018, because the UK was part of the EU, we had the EU General Data Protection Regulation. And all that's really happened is as we left the EU, we kept the same kind of principles and concepts that were within that EU legislation, but we've moved it into our UK GDPR legislation. What's interesting to understand is if you're an organisation operating in the UK, that's kind of the legislation the UK General Data Protection Regulation needs to be aware of. But if your services are being accessed by those in the UK and also the EU, you've essentially got to comply with both. So although they're similar, you need to be aware of that there are requirements in both those pieces of legislation that as a company, you need to know what those requirements are and have a think about whether you're meeting all of those. Certainly in my experience, 2018 was a really big year for data protection and companies did a lot of work getting ready. However, in more recent years, as other pieces of legislation and the sort of trends around data protection have gone a little bit more, there's less news about it, although I'd say there's more news about it than in recent weeks. Organisations maybe need to have another check back and see, are we actually doing everything here that we're supposed to be doing? Or would we benefit from somebody having a look at our practices to see actually, are we meeting all of the data protection requirements that we need to be aware of?
Absolutely, no, it's a very good point there. So I think it'd be really, really helpful for our viewers if you could maybe sort of touch on some of the key things that the games developers in particular need to be considering in relation to GDPR in the UK as businesses essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a fantastic time at your Ukie conference last week at the Ukie Members Day. and
Well,
talked to
thank
some
you.
of the talked to some great people there. And if anybody's watching this, it was lovely to meet you. But what you've kind of got to recognise is that games companies, some of them are small businesses, some of them are a bit larger. But as a business, you've kind of got to balance those legal requirements. You know, there's health and safety, there's employment law. Data protection is just one more piece of that puzzle. And there are things that small businesses and medium businesses need to think about. So as an example, you may need to register your organisation with the Information Commissioner's Office. A little bit like Companies House, the ICO maintains a register of organisations who are processing personal data. And I mentioned that I'm a data protection officer, that's been my career, and some organisations need to appoint a data protection officer. The GDPR, when it came in, I said that the growth in that career space of data protection officers, but actually all organisations should have somebody who is taking on the responsibility of looking at this, not being aware of the legislation, not keeping yourself informed of some of the smaller things as a small business you should be doing, like having a privacy notice, is really just sticking your head in the sand and pushing the problem down the line. As a business, as you grow, if you can get these things built in early, and even if it's just a couple of days a year, somebody goes on some training or you seek some support from a data protection professional just to check that you're putting in place some of those key steps that can really help your business as you develop and grow down the line.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned sort of privacy notices there, and I'm assuming sort of this sort of feeds into things like data sharing and marketing as well. I mean, are there any sort of specifics that you want to sort of highlight, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. So privacy notices are really, I call them like your window into your company's data protection maturity. So I've worked in the NHS and I've worked in education on the buying side, so bringing in apps and products into those public bodies that are being sold by developers and companies creating those. And one of the first things we check as a data protection professional is, does that company have a privacy notice? Because it tells me straight away how up to date their data protection knowledge is. If it was introduced in May 2018 and hasn't been reviewed since, that gives me a pretty clear indication about how much of a priority data protection is for that company. And if they're asking the NHS body or the school that I'm working with to buy that product, it's going to be one of those things that's giving me some assurance as to how good they are or not. I had a really good experience with a supplier recently, and they answered all my questions. They talked about cyber essentials and ISO 27001. They talked about things like that their staff do annual data protection training. And they had various information on their website about how their IT solution was secured. And all of those things made my job as a data protection professional really easy. Because data protection, at the end of the day, it's about risk. If I'm working with a client and they want to buy a product, they're taking a risk that that product both meets their needs, but also is going to do what it says on the tin. And it helps provide some risk assurance that the organisation has those steps in place.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, out of curiosity, obviously, you know, because of the nature of games, a lot of companies in this space, you know, have an awful lot of sort of sensitive information, personal information. I mean, for their customers and their players, essentially. I mean, in terms of sort of like the marketing side of things, is there any sort of any element that would be, you know, first port of call for people to be sort of considering in terms of shoring things up around GDPR for games businesses?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You mentioned GDPR there, but one of the key pieces of legislation is actually PECA, so Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations. And that's about things like cookies on your website and targeting users, specific activity that users are doing, data sharing with third parties, so analytics services or data brokers of any kind. You really want to make sure you've got some sort of agreement there that says you've got this personal data, you're going to share it with this third party. Do you know what they're going to do with that data? Because ultimately you've collected it and you're looking after it for your service users. One of the key parts of my job is looking at data sharing agreements and documents in place with other organisations that may be handling that data. The Information Commissioner's Office, which is the regulator for data protection law and privacy and electronic communications, they're actually a really excellent regulator, in my opinion, in that they churn out guidance documents at a really Pretty high rate. So they have some accountability frameworks, they have some spreadsheets. If you wanted to do a sort of check on whether you had everything in place as a company, all the information you needed would be available on the ICO website. And they do tailor it for small businesses as well. They've got various trackers. So that as a regulator, they're quite proactive in providing advice and guidance. And they say they want to work with organisations. And one of my favourite quotes from the Children's Code is that it's a statutory code of practice that's seeking to protect children within the digital world, not protect them from it. And the ICO talks about working with organisations to make sure, yes, we are protecting people's personal data, but we're not preventing them from accessing services or things that they want to access. So they're very collaborative as a regulator.
Oh, it's really good to hear that there's a decent amount of support there, especially for small businesses. I mean, you mentioned the children's code there. I mean, we were going to sort of talk a little bit more in depth about this. I mean, what's within the scope of the children's code? Would you be able to sort of elaborate on what it does cover?
Yeah, so the Children's Code is a statutory code of practice, and what that means is it's a set of requirements that supplement the GDPR and explain the things that organisations need to do, and if you're not doing those, you're essentially not complying with the GDPR. And in terms of who must comply, it's any information society service, and that kind of means an online service like a game that is likely to be accessed by children, even if it isn't explicitly aimed at children. So if your game is a U-rated or doesn't have an over 18 rating, you're probably caught by the Children's Code. Even if your game is an 18+ rating, there is an argument to be made that your game may be accessed by children, and you certainly need to be putting in controls to prevent age-appropriate access, to ensure that only adults are accessing that material. I thought it was really interesting at the Ukie Members Day. There's some of the talks, somebody mentioned having to go down to a game shop in the past and buy the game on the day it was released. And if you think about the controls there, it was really easy, because if somebody didn't look old enough, or you assume that the shop would be the one responsible for ensuring that that game was being accessed by somebody age appropriately. Whereas now online, even if somebody's got parental controls in place, that doesn't necessarily mean that a child won't be accessing the game. So there's a lot more responsibility being placed on the games makers and those who are distributing games to make sure that under 18s are not accessing things they shouldn't be. And actually, when they are accessing games and using games and materials that are targeted to them, that they take into account the controls within the Children's Code that are there to protect them, because there's that recognition that children do need more protection than adults.
No, absolutely. Yeah, it's a very, very good point there. I mean, times have completely changed in the last sort of 20 years or so, haven't they, really? So in terms of that sort of compliance, what are the demands on sort of smaller, all businesses, I suppose, but particularly maybe looking at games businesses in terms of the sort of demands on them around compliance with the Children's Code then?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting, the ICO has actually said this week. I think they're renewing their focus on the Children's Code. So there's been some pieces in the news about social media platforms, but I just want to quote what they said. And they said, "I want to make it very clear, focusing our efforts on some of the largest, most well-known platforms, we're not giving smaller companies a free pass to adopt or continue unlawful practices." They've said it's a warning shot, and then they've said all organisations using children's data or who are offering products or services that may be accessed by children need to conform with the Children's Code. So I think there's this renewed energy around the Children's Code, a lot to do with what's happened in social media, but some of the court cases that we've seen and some of the tragic cases about children and young people who've been negatively affected by online services has kind of put some more pressure there. So even if you took a look at the Children's Code when it first came into force, I think it's really worth checking that again. I mentioned earlier that data protection is all about risk, and the ICO has a spreadsheet with all the different requirements of the Children's Code. But what you've got to think about as an organisation is how much risk are we at here? How much data do we have? How likely is it that our services are accessed by children? What do we do already to make sure we're compliant with data protection? I think one of the first things I would recommend is just being aware. It's no good just thinking, oh, this probably doesn't affect us. Get somebody in your organisation to go on some training, to watch the ICO has YouTube videos about the Children's Code, or look at content from organisations such as ourselves that talk more, and this video talk more about what the Children's Code is. So one of the first things that it requires is that you assess whether children are likely to access your service, and you can evidence whether that's the case or not. Data protection is all about, I said risk, but also accountability. So documenting what your organisation does to meet any standards that it might be subject to. So you've got that accountability piece where you need to do training, make yourself aware of the requirements.
Brilliant. Well, in addition to sort of training and everything, I mean, what are some of the more specific things that a games business might be worth their while sort of looking into making some changes on?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned earlier that as a small or medium business, you need to have that privacy notice, and that is the way you present yourself to the world in terms of data protection compliance. And part of the Children's Code is about transparency. So providing privacy information to children about how you collect and use their data, making sure that that's written in a way that's meaningful to children. And you might need 2 privacy notices, or even more than 2, one for very young children, one for sort of slightly older, and then one for parents and guardians as well. What I liked about the Members Day is that I talked to a few organisations who were involved in children working with games developers and giving young people opportunity. The ICO recommends you consult with your service users on all of your data protection practices, but there's real opportunity there for games developers to work with young people and say, do these profiling questions make sense to you? Do you understand what we're asking you here in our privacy notice? And being able to evidence you're doing that is really excellent demonstration of your compliance. And it's the sort of thing you can say to prospective buyers of your product. You know, we've consulted with children about, do they understand how their data is used? We've asked for their feedback about the use of these nudge techniques, and they know that they are pushing them to more pro-privacy controls. So involving your service users is a theme that runs throughout data protection, and a really good way to get some unexpected or different feedback from your service users.
Oh, that's really, really good to hear. Yeah, absolutely. I think it makes a lot of sense to be listening ultimately, and being able to be seen to be sort of adapting and taking on sort of new ideas in this realm.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it'd be really sort of not to spread too much fear and panic in our audience, but it would be probably quite helpful to have a look at some of the consequences of non-compliance. You know, this is ultimately a very serious issue.
In terms of consequences from data protection law, it's kind of easy to say the fines are a part of it, and they are. And the ICO have announced recently that they're investigating TikTok, and it's not the first time they've fined TikTok in the past, and that's to do with age assurance and the age-appropriate design elements that are within the Children's Code. There's another case I've seen recently, which was to do with a betting company. And they used the profiling and the information they gathered. And in the end, the individual brought a court case and sued the company for essentially furthering their gambling addiction through this profiling and this targeted advertising. So people are becoming more aware of how their data is used. And when they discover that it's been used in unfair ways, they are keen to push back on that. And I think that speaks to the reputation piece. There's a lot in the news at the minute about the age of social media users and parental concerns. And I think there's a risk if the games industry doesn't get ahead of this and starts making sure it's advertising all the positive things it does to comply, they may face some of the pushback we've seen in the social media space from parents and carers and people who are concerned. I think the Children's Code, if you complied with it and showed your compliance, it would provide a lot of reassurance to people who might be concerned, and help prevent some of those issues further down the line. Just one final piece as well. Data protection is all about privacy by design. So bringing in those privacy facing practices at the start, because actually if you plow on ahead and develop a product and find out later, possibly through feedback from users, that it doesn't work and it doesn't comply, you've got all that cost of that development work that you've got to undo to rectify the issue further down the line. So having somebody with a privacy facing role or a focus on privacy all the way through the development can help catch those issues early on and be something that you build into your work plan, rather than something when you find out later down the line it's not working, that's going to be a cost to put it right.
Fantastic. No, that's absolutely brilliant. I mean, the less we have to reinvent the wheel, the better, ultimately, I suppose.
You said about reinventing the wheel. One of the things I thought was great this week that the ICO sort of reminded people of is they put some examples of good practice in relation to age-appropriate design. So the two games companies that the ICO gave examples of were Sony Interactive Entertainment and Epic Games. And we can put the link in the show notes if that's possible, but they gave examples about how they did some age-appropriate design as good practice. So saying about the ICO wanting to work collaboratively with games developers. So it's keeping an eye on their pages and being aware of the examples of good practice as well as the examples of when things have gone wrong.
Absolutely, yeah. We'll absolutely put those links in the show notes down at the bottom there. Fantastic. Well, any sort of final advice that you want to give for games developers navigating these regulations?
Yeah. I think don't be intimidated by it. It sounds quite scary. It sounds like there's a lot to get on top of, but actually there are some key themes in data protection that just make, I hate to say common sense, but making sure you're informed about some of the things you need to comply with, making sure that your public-facing documentation, like your privacy notice, is up to date, any kind of assurance that you can do in terms of external audits or cyber essentials or ISO 27001, advertising that fact on your website and showing that you do take privacy seriously is really important. And it is an ever-changing space. AI is having an impact in the data protection world. Just this week, I've been working with a client and they want to buy a product and they've got everything in place from a data protection perspective traditionally, but part of this product is an AI chatbot. And we've had a conversation about what assurance they've done around that. And the company hasn't got that far down the assurance road with the AI, but obviously it's been in the media a lot recently. So it's something we're pushing the company to give us some more information about. So making sure that any new technology that you're bringing in, you've got to think about that in a privacy and data protection way as well.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you so much, Jess. It's been really, really good talking to you. I think there's an awful lot there for games businesses to consider and to take away. And it's wonderful to see that there's a decent amount of support on offer and some guidance and sharing of best practices, which is ultimately what we're all about here at Ukie. So yeah, fantastic stuff. Well, thank you again. Really appreciate your time today. And thank you as well to our audience who tuned in to catch this video. There's plenty of other need to know videos out there on our Ukie TV channel on YouTube. Thank you for enjoying this one and more very soon. Thank you so much.